Hello and welcome to our strategic talks within the Strategic Compass program, which I run for Harici. Harici is the only, presumably the most extensive foreign news analysis and foreign news portal in Turkey. And today we are quite proud because we are now joined by Professor de Zayas, Alfred de Zayas. He's accepted our invitation to be with us for the program. And thank you very much, Professor de Zayas, for joining our program. And well, if nothing else to say, let's basically go ahead with the program and immediately start our strategic talk on the escalation of the Ukrainian conflict. I think I'd like to address a question first, because I've been following your writings and I've also been following your programs, and you've been quite critical of the Western handling of the Ukrainian crisis right from the beginning. Indeed, you are one of the very few vociferous critiques of the West. I'm sorry about that. And let's start with the beginning of the conflict a bit. And let's, please give us your take on the origins of the conflict. And also, can you comment on the Western rejection of diplomacy on the resolution of the crisis? How are we going to resolve it? I mean, given that the Cuban Missile Crisis, as it broke out, minutes after it broke out, there was diplomacy all the time, and through diplomacy, the world basically managed to resolve the crisis. But now the Western world is consistently and stubbornly rejecting diplomacy. Please go ahead.
Well, as I say, it's a rebellion against international law. It's a rebellion against the United Nations Charter. The very essence of the Charter is peacemaking. It is the prevention of conflict. And Article 2, Paragraph 3 of the UN Charter is very clear that there is a positive obligation on all members of the United Nations to solve their disputes by peaceful means. That is not only to prevent the outbreak of hostilities, but once the hostilities have broken out, there's a continuing obligation to negotiate in order to find a compromise and stop the hostilities. That is what President Erdogan did. And that was the compromise that was reached and agreed to by the Ukrainian representatives and by the Russian representatives, which was subsequently torpedoed by Boris Johnson and by Joe Biden. So that actually constitutes a crime against peace and a crime against humanity. There's no justification for prolonging a war. If there is an outbreak of hostility, it is for the Security Council, it is for the United Nations, it is for the General Assembly under Uniting for Peace resolution to stop the slaughter and to try to negotiate, to try to craft a modus vivendi between the contenders. Now, this has been, shall we say, the credo of civilization, not only of the West or not only of the United Nations Charter. This already goes back to the Peace of Westphalia of 1648 that ended the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, with 8 million deaths in Europe. Now, my concern as a professor of international law is that the United Nations is losing credibility. Since pronouncements of the Secretary General are not being respected, since judgments of the International Court of Justice, advisory opinions of the International Court of Justice are being flouted primarily by the United States and the West, we are at a crossroads. Either we reaffirm our commitment to the United Nations and to the United Nations Charter, or we have to devise another way of living together in peace. Otherwise, the alternative is apocalypse. The alternative is nuclear warfare. Now, this is totally insane, what we have seen over the last few years, but the war did not start on the 24th of February 2022. It started even before the coup d'etat of 22 February 2014 in Maidan. I mean, Ukraine had a democratically elected president, Viktor Yanukovych, and unfortunately, because of the subversion through the United States, through European non-governmental organizations, which you can very easily class in the category of foreign agents, these organizations destabilized the government and then, of course, were violent. I mean, the demonstrations were not peaceful demonstrations.
They were not.
We know from Victoria Nuland and from all the leaks that have occurred, we know the responsibility of the administration of Obama and of Hillary Clinton back in 2014. But then there was the Minsk agreements, Minsk I and Minsk II. They provided for a reasonable modus vivendi between the Ukrainians, the Russian Ukrainians of the Donbass, and Russia. Unfortunately, Ukraine sabotaged it on a permanent basis, and both President Poroshenko and President Zelensky, in spite of all of their lip service to international law, were violating it on a daily basis. And as we have learned subsequently, basically Vladimir Putin was taken for a ride because Angela Merkel and Francois Hollande never entered the Minsk agreement in good faith, as they themselves have confessed subsequently. They just wanted to gain time to arm Ukraine to the teeth. Now, let's backtrack to 1989, 1990, 1991. There were oral commitments made by George H.W. Bush and by his Secretary of State, James Baker, not to expand NATO eastwards. Now, the world had really one brief shining moment when we could have achieved world peace. Gorbachev was prepared for disarmament, including nuclear disarmament, and we could have actually converted the military first economies of both East and West into human security economies. I wrote a report about that for the General Assembly. As the case may be, this possibility was wasted. But not only was it wasted, way back in the 90s, the program or project for a new American century, and Brzezinski's book, The European, the Great Chessboard, indicated an animus dominandi on the part of the United States. The United States was bent on being the only power in the world, essentially replacing the United Nations. So we have this period of unipolarity, and the United States uses it to encircle Russia. NATO, being also the military arm of the United States, starts breaking the oral agreements made in 1989, 1990, and expanding eastward, something very strongly condemned by our diplomat par excellence, John F. Kennan, whom I knew personally and whom I interviewed several times at Princeton University. In 1997, he wrote this famous article, A Fatal Error, was an opinion piece in the New York Times. Now, NATO has actually provoked the Russian bear nonstop. And even Boris Yeltsin, who was very much a puppet of the United States, he signaled that this posed a problem. And when Putin came to power, he continued stating that he wanted a security architecture for all of Europe, including Russia, taking into account Russia's legitimate security concerns. Now, the United States thought that it was so powerful that it just could do anything it wanted and forced Russia to accept it. Well, that's what had happened in the years 2004, 2007, very famous speech by Putin in Munich, the security conference. Then we have 2008, the Bucharest meeting of NATO, in which Bush announces that he's inviting Georgia and Ukraine to join NATO. Now, if there ever was a red line, that was it. It's as if, say, Mexico decided to enter into a military alliance with China, or into a military alliance with Russia. I mean, this is a matter of national security, and you have to understand it as such. The United States would never have tolerated that. And we should actually respect the red lines of other countries. And it is irritating when one reads the mainstream media, how Joe Biden and Anthony Blinken and Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak and Emmanuel Macron and Olaf Scholz always speak of an unprovoked attack by Russia on Ukraine. Well, if there ever was a preemptive or a preventive war, this was it. I mean, Russia has spent decades saying, this is the red line and you have crossed it. And this poses an existential danger to us. Now, I am not justifying the invasion of Russia. Of course, Russia's invasion entailed a violation, a gross violation of Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter, the prohibition of the use of force. But this, again, has to be seen in the historical context. Article 2, Paragraph 4 prohibits not only the use of force, but it also prohibits the threat of the use of force. And NATO's expansion was eminently a threat of the use of force, the same as the attempts of NATO to expand in the Asia-Pacific region. That is an existential threat against China. And this kind of escalation, this type of needless poking of your adversary is super dangerous when you're dealing with nuclear powers. Now, my criticism, I'm not alone. Professor John Mersheimer of Chicago, Professor Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia, Dan Kovalik of Pittsburgh, Francis Boyle of Illinois, Stephen Kinzer of Boston, all say the same thing.
Or even Henry Kissinger, actually, the late Henry Kissinger. He used to warn the United States administration, and yeah.
No, what I want is a return to rationality. What worries me is the absence of rationality in what I see in the capitals in Washington, London, Paris, and Berlin. I mean, there is a narrative which is being repeated ad nauseam, and there are think tanks telling us that we can fight Russia and China simultaneously and win. I mean, there is kind of a war euphoria that we can beat the Russians and we can beat the Chinese. Now, it's quite weird.
Professor de Zayas, can I just intervene shortly, just at this point, actually. Thank you for actually giving a very clear basis on which how Russia was actually provoked into the war prior to the outbreak of the war and in the first months of the war, and also after a couple of years of war in which the Western presumptions all collapsed because actually their assumptions were they had basically two assumptions, that the Russian economy was going to collapse and the Russian military was not going to perform as well as it has been performing since the outbreak of the war. So Russia was going to be brought down onto its knees economically, militarily, and what have you. And then they were going to basically swoop on Russia. And then Russia's resources, because the Russian people were going to take Putin out of Kremlin, they were going to change everything upside down. There was going to be an absolute turmoil across the Russian lands. And according to so many think tanks and others, including some of the politicians in official positions in the Baltics, Romania, Poland, and other West European countries, Russia was going to be divided up into pieces.
Exactly.
Now, thank you. And since all these assumptions basically have fallen, now I can't understand how come the West would have the stamina and the courage to carry on with the fight on the ground against a major nuclear power whose nuclear arsenal is much larger than their own put together. And now, do you subscribe to the view that there is a fast escalation of the conflict actually in Ukraine, because the United States in particular and some of the European countries have given Ukraine the go-ahead to use the weapons and ammunition they supplied Ukraine with against targets within Russia. And this is a very dangerous beginning. And as we saw just days ago, the Ukrainians are not, they are not just using them against the military target, but also against civilians. I mean, there should be a limit to which Putin's and the Russians and Russia's state establishments' patience would be tested. At some stage, they are going to respond to all these senseless attacks by Ukraine, but at the same time by the United States and their close friends and allies. Now, how do you assess this escalation, and where and how do you think the Russians would respond to?
Well, there was an unwillingness on the part of the United States, and not only the United States, also the European Union states and the United Kingdom, to accept that we have made grave mistakes and grave miscalculations. This is a problem of narcissism. It's a problem of being caught in your own web. I mean, we are trapped in our own ideology, and we do not want to accept, and even not yet, that we are the cause of the problem, that we provoked Russia into an invasion that Russia had no intention of doing. If you look at the Minsk agreements, and if you look at the treaties that Sergei Lavrov put on the table in December 2021, the treaty between Russia and NATO and between Russia and the United States, they guaranteed the territorial integrity of Ukraine. They guaranteed the sovereignty of Ukraine. They gave all sorts of assurances, and the only quid pro quo that Russia was proposing was, one, Ukraine would remain outside of NATO. Ukraine would be neutral. And as far as the Russian-speaking minorities, or rather majorities, in the Donbass, in Lugansk, in Slavyansk, in Donetsk, in Zaporizhia, etc., that they would have what we call internal self-determination, that they would have an autonomous status that will allow them within Ukraine, but that would allow them to practice their language, their culture, their traditions, their religion. Don't forget that they are Russian Orthodox, and many in the Ukraine are either Catholics or Ukrainian Orthodox, etc. So it's a matter of self-determination. And self-determination is not the cause of the conflict. The cause of the conflict is the denial of this right of self-determination, which is a jus cogens right. And I thought that both the Minsk agreements and the treaties that Lavrov proposed in 2021 were very moderate. They were solidly anchored in the United Nations Charter, and they were entirely viable. What happened? Jens Stoltenberg arrogantly rejected them out of hand, repeating the mantra that the open door policy of NATO could not be sacrificed, and any country who wants to join NATO has the, quote, right, unquote, to do so. Well, in the real world, it doesn't work like that. In the real world, there are legitimate concerns of national security. And Russia has articulated those concerns, has so informed the European capitals and Washington, and said, look, you know, let's sit down and talk. But of course, we were intransigent, we were narcissistic, we were arrogant, and ultimately we provoked Russia into doing something which was illegal. But allow me to coin a term: precedence of permissibility. Mm-hmm. This is not the first time since the Second World War that Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter is violated. The United States has violated it nonstop in Latin America when the United States has used military force to overthrow governments, whether it be in Haiti or in the Dominican Republic or in Honduras or in Chile. I mean, the involvement of the United States in overthrowing governments is shocking. The war of the United States against the people of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, 4 million deaths. I mean, that was a crime against humanity if there ever was one. The NATO bombardment of Yugoslavia, of Belgrade, thoroughly illegal, thoroughly unjustified. The U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 on completely false pretexts. The war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by NATO forces in Afghanistan and in Libya and in Syria, etc. I mean, the record of NATO crimes is so horrendous that shall we say, the sanctity of Article 2, Paragraph 4 has been significantly reduced by NATO, by the United States. Talk about territorial integrity. I believe in territorial integrity as a principle of stability. You want to have stability in international affairs. You want to have predictability in international affairs. You don't want to have borders changing all the time. On the other hand, who destroyed the territorial integrity of Yugoslavia? The United States and NATO. I mean, we actually went out there, bombarded the hell out of Belgrade and of Serbia, destroyed all the bridges of the Danube, etc., because we wanted to tear Kosovo away from Serbia, thereby destroying the territorial integrity of Serbia. Now, if the United States does that in total impunity, well, you can imagine that other countries will follow the example of the United States and NATO countries. That does not justify it. It remains a violation of international law. It remains a violation of the UN Charter, but it is not unprecedented. And what we need today, of course, is an immediate ceasefire. We need an immediate ceasefire in Ukraine.
Can I also interview, Professor de Zayas? Here, before we go on to the how we resolve the conflict in Ukraine in particular, can I ask you the question, because you have written extensively that NATO in particular, over the last few decades or so, has morphed into almost like a criminal organization. You know,
yes,
the word criminal organization is a very interesting word, to say the least. But you know, now, for instance, NATO's declaration of the latest summit in Vilnius last year, for instance, talks about very dangerous things being cooked up in NATO. For instance, it not only presents Russia as the enemy to the NATO world, but it also talks about rising China as a threat to world peace and security. And it then says that NATO is actually coordinating actions with its friends and allies in the Asia Pacific to contain China. These are very dangerous things. So what are we doing in NATO? For instance, Turkey is also a NATO country, although it doesn't actually condone any of that, as seen.
Well, NATO was initially a legitimate defense alliance founded in 1949 But this defense alliance should have been dismantled in the year 1991 when the Warsaw Pact was disbanded. I mean, there was no raison d'etre. There's no justification to continue the existence of NATO, which actually has attempted to usurp the functions of the United Nations in peacekeeping, the functions of the Security Council. It is possible in the world established under the United Nations Charter to have regional security organizations and security arrangements, Article 52 of the Charter. But Article 52 is very clear. These regional organizations must be subordinated to the United Nations and must pursue the same peace purposes and principles of the United Nations. In the moment that the organization, like NATO, engages in bullying, engages in intimidation, encircles other nations, it is in gross violation of Article 2, Paragraph 4. They're acting against the object and purpose of the United Nations organization. For that reason, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization could be already called an illegal organization. But I go one step further. I have taught the Nuremberg trials and the Tokyo trials, and I looked at Articles 9 and 10 of the statute of the International Military Tribunal for Nuremberg. And I looked at the Nuremberg judgment of 1946. Now, you have the concept of criminal organization. Criminal organization is an organization that pursues aggressive policies, an organization that commits war crimes and crimes against humanity in impunity, an organization that does not have, shall we say, a self-regulatory system whereby major war crimes, as those revealed by Julian Assange, was finally released from Belmarsh prison yesterday.
Though he wasn't acquitted of all the charges.
It is shocking. And this is the book by my friend and colleague, Professor Niels Meltzer, who was the United Nations Rapporteur on torture at the same time as I was the Rapporteur on international order. Now, I visited Julian Assange. He visited Julian Assange, and he published this book, which documents, shockingly, the collapse of the rule of law in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in Sweden, in Ecuador, everybody involved in the persecution of Julian Assange, who, in my opinion, more than deserves the Nobel Peace Prize, and someone who has done the world an enormous service. Because it is important when you have state secrecy that there is such a thing as a whistleblower. It's important in order to control governments that are out of control. It's important that you have whistleblowers that will uncover those crimes being committed in your name, in my name. I don't want my government. I am, by the way, both a United States citizen and I am a citizen of Switzerland. And I don't want my country, the United States, to be aggressing other countries. I don't want my country to be subverting the democracy in other countries. I don't want my country to be torturing people in Guantanamo and in Mosul and in Abu Ghraib, etc. So here you have a hero of our time, Julian Assange. Another hero of our time, of course, is Edward Snowden, whose book, Permanent Record, I recommend to all of your viewers. In any event, my concern here is retrogression in international law and in human rights law, which is happening before our eyes. And this is being condoned. This is being driven by the mainstream media, New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, CNN, BBC, Le Monde, El País, El Mundo, Die Zeit, Der Spiegel, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, etc. We are really at a crossroads. I mean, the very foundations of civilization are being challenged. And it's not China that is challenging them. It's not Russia that is challenging them. It's Washington, D.C. I mean, we in the United States have taken the attitude, either you're with us or you're against us. There's no middle way. Either you go with us and you obey us, or we will destroy you. And that is super dangerous in a nuclear context. Now, Putin does not intend to use...
Professor de Zayas, could we just add one further dimension to your very important analysis, I think, that NATO, over the last few decades, in particularly after the end of the Cold War, has gradually morphed into a criminal organization. And you have cited actually all the reasons why you have concluded. You have made that conclusion. Now, can we not make the same conclusion based on the behavior of the United States about Washington? Because the Washington seems to be acting, certainly in contradiction, even in certain cases, against the international law in all aspects. So it is also totally a lawless country in terms of international law. And
the global majority in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, they understand that. We in the West, I'm living in Switzerland, but also I read, of course, the American press, and I read the British press, and I read the French press and the German press. We in the West are in a bubble, and we think that we are the defenders of civilization. We're not. We think that we're the defenders of human rights values. We're not. We're actually dismantling the whole system of protection of human rights and of the rule of law. Now, I published an article recently under the Latin maxim, quis custodiet ipsos custodes. This is from the 6th satire of the Roman thinker and poet Juvenal. Who will be guarding over the guardians? What do you do when the institutions created to defend your rights actually betray you? What do you do when the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, when the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, when the International Atomic Energy Agency, when the International Civil Aviation Organization, when the International Criminal Court, when it turns out that they're actually in the service of Washington and Brussels? What do you do? I mean, we must be the guardians we are the only ones who can set it straight. We simply have to say, not in our name. We have to simply demand from our democratic leaders that they act democratically. Now, as I said, I'm not alone. Professor John Mersheimer, with his book, The Great Delusion, he explains the epistemological problems that we are facing. We're facing the destruction of language. As you may know, today is the birthday of Eric Blair. Eric Blair is none other than George Orwell. Now, George Orwell warned us of the danger of totalitarianism. He warned us of the danger of groupthink. He warned us of the danger of the destruction of language. And we actually have embraced all of that. Sometimes I think that our world today, in many ways, has gone beyond the dystopia of 1984. If you were familiar with Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, we are actually more in the Brave New World context than in the 1984 context, because the great swathes of the population, including academia, including the universities, they have been so effectively brainwashed that they actually believe the nonsense that they're saying. I mean, I'm not even going to tell you that Anthony Blinken is a rabid hypocrite. I'm not going to say that Joe Biden is an evil narcissist. No, I actually believe that he thinks he's right. Mm-hmm. And let's face it, I was educated in Chicago, in my high school. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, etc., etc. Well, I do pledge allegiance, but I'm not blind. I want my country to live according to the Constitution. I want my country to live up to the treaties that we have signed. After all, the treaties are, according to Article 5 of the Constitution, the law of the land. So when my country breaks treaty after treaty, when my country rebels against international law and human rights law, I want to protest, and I'm very proud that my friends, professors, and students at Harvard University and at Columbia University and at Berkeley and at UCLA have been demonstrating in favor of the right of self-determination of the Palestinian people. I think that is honorable. When I was their age, when I was at Harvard Law School back in the 1960s and 70s, I demonstrated against the Vietnam War because I thought the Vietnam War was a crime against humanity. And these students today at Harvard, including at the graduation the other day, were demonstrating against the genocide that is happening before our eyes in Israel, in Gaza. And I must say, Erdogan has been one of the voices of reason criticizing Israel for the crimes, for the genocide that they are committing. Now, I have written a trilogy of human rights. After my 6 years as rapporteur on international order, I published this book, Building a Just World Order. That was 2021. And that contains 25 principles of international order, which I explain and I apply in concrete situations. The then president of the General Assembly, Maria Fernanda Espinosa, called it a Magna Carta for humanity in the 21st century. The book has very important chapters on the human right to peace, on the necessity of disarmament for development, on the necessary reforms of the United Nations, of the Security Council, but also of the International Monetary Fund and of the World Bank. And then I also wrote a book concerning the manipulation of public opinion in the West. This was countering mainstream narratives. This is a book that takes on a series of classical examples of manipulation of public opinion through fake news, fake history, fake law, fake diplomacy, fake democracy. And then after 50 years of working in the United Nations system as a senior lawyer in the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, I was the secretary of the Human Rights Committee, and I was the registrar. I was the chief of the petitions department. So all complaints, Human Rights Committee, Committee Against Torture, Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, ran through my desk. And I had the opportunity, basically, because I was there from day one, I had the opportunity of writing the rules of procedure and of drafting the early decisions of these bodies. So I thought that as a veteran human rights worker, that I could allow myself this criticism: the human rights industry. And the human rights industry is actually a very constructive book. I'm not trying to tear down the system, far from it. I am trying to make concrete, pragmatic, implementable proposals how to fix the problems that are there. And there are endemic problems. One of them is in recruitment. I would say the vast majority of the Secretariat of the United States, of the United Nations, is, shall we say, favorable to what we call the collective West. Who gets hired into the system, how they get hired into the system, where have they had their educations, etc. So there is, even when you have people from third world countries in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, many of them who have been hired had their educations in the United States or in Great Britain or in France, etc., and were imbued with the Eurocentric or Western approach to human rights, on the Western approach to international law. And we have this concept of exceptionalism that we in the West, by definition, we are the good guys. So we are legitimized in dictating what a rules-based international order should be. We are legitimized to interpret international law in our way. So we don't care what the third world or the global South thinks. We know better, and we tell them what to do. That is reflected, and it is actually driven by a secretariat that is not professional, a secretariat that is not impartial. When I joined the system back in 1980, I was personally hired by Professor Theo van Boven. He was the then director of the Division on Human Rights. We were a much smaller office, but we were really committed. And we did not make any distinctions. We were looking at the necessity of standard setting, the necessity of creating mechanisms, and the necessity of applying international law rigorously in a really objective, neutral fashion. I mean, for us, selectivity and double standards were the devil. I mean, we were very careful not to apply double standards. For instance, when I wrote an article for the International Committee of the Red Cross called Human Rights and Indefinite Detention. And in that, right, I applied the principles to Guantanamo and to the CIA secret prisons and to the extraordinary rendition programs, etc. And I said, look, we have vast jurisprudence that we established when we were looking at the violations of the most fundamental principles of the rule of law by Argentina, by Uruguay, by Chile, by Colombia, in those years of the military juntas and those years of the disappearances and of the murders and of the torture, etc., etc. And I say, if we condemned Uruguay and Argentina and Chile for torture, then we must condemn the United States for torture committed in Guantanamo and elsewhere. And I must say I am comforted that some really great minds like Jeffrey Sachs are speaking out. Now, Jeffrey Sachs has been for 20 years the United Nations expert on the Sustainable Development Goals. I mean, he was the advisor of Kofi Annan, the advisor of Ban Ki-moon. He is the advisor of Antonio Guterres on matters of Sustainable Development Goals, but which, of course, are impossible to achieve. Forget it. By 2030, there's no way in the world that we can achieve the SDGs, considering that the mass of the riches of the United States and Europe are going into war. We're not putting that money into development. We're not putting that money into infrastructures and really advancing the world. What is, for me, encouraging is that there's such a thing as the Shanghai Cooperation Council. There's such a thing as the Belt and Road Initiative, and most importantly, the BRICS. And I believe that Turkey has an interest in joining the BRICS. And there's a whole queue of countries who want to join the BRICS. So it is time to move to a peaceful, multilateral, multipolar world under the United Nations Charter. I mean, I'm very much in favor of having reforms in the United Nations system, but let us not throw the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, I criticize the system, but I want to maintain the system. I want to clean it up. I want to strengthen it so that it is more effective. In order to do that, of course, you also need international solidarity. And international solidarity depends also on a peaceful environment. That's why peace is the alpha and omega. We need peace in Ukraine. We need peace in Gaza. And I hope that Turkey will be playing an important role in mediating in Ukraine and mediating in Gaza. I mean, as I said, I am also a Swiss citizen, and I was dismayed. I was angry when this farcical peace conference was held here in Switzerland at the Bürgenstock, where I have been several times with my wife. It's an absolutely glorious place. I mean, for the panorama and for the food and for everything, it's gorgeous. But to pretend that that had anything to do with peace, to pretend that that could advance the peace agenda is so ridiculous, especially when Russia was not invited, when China did not participate. And then, which is most exciting, even though a number of countries, important countries, did participate, they refused to sign the final document. Among them, India. India refused. Indonesia refused. South Africa refused. Brazil refused. Mexico refused. So who was there applauding Mr. Zelensky? Well, the usual suspects. The Americans, the Canadians, the Brits, also the French, etc. But it was an exercise in narcissism. It did not advance peace in Ukraine by 1 inch. And going back to the dangers of giving F-16s to the Ukrainians, obviously they will never pose a real danger to Russia. I mean, whatever they're getting, they will be a significant annoyance. I mean, they will kill civilians, as they just killed 2 days ago in Crimea, in Sebastopol, where a number of civilians and children on the beach on the Black Sea were killed by the debris of one of these American drones. Now, this is horrible. It's horrible, but it's not going to change the outcome of the war. We can send as many howitzers or as many patriots as we want. It will not change the outcome. And what we have to say is cut our losses. The United States is known for, or rather notorious for, its practice of withdrawing after losing a war. I mean, we lost the war in Vietnam. We killed 4 million people, but then we pulled out and then we turned the page like if nothing had happened. We killed 1 million people in Afghanistan, 20 years of torturing these people. Okay, we turn the page and we leave. Again, it's ridiculous, but I want the United States to turn the page in Ukraine and say, okay, we did not reach our goal. Let's forget about it and let's move forward. Because what we've done to the Ukrainians is such a crime. We put in the money, we put in the weapons, and they put in the blood. They put in their, you know, the flower of their youth that has been sent to the meat grinder.
Yeah. Unfortunately, on that point, could I intervene again and then address you a very short question? Perhaps as we are running out of time, but the talk has been extremely good, and I thank you wholeheartedly for that. I'd like to have your take on the possibility of Trump coming to power in the United States and on these anti-establishment parties that have been presented as the extreme right wing by the establishment again across Europe, perhaps even including in Britain, you know, with Nigel Farage's fast rise. Now, Can we or should we see a ray of hope in all that to bring the conflict to an end in Ukraine first, and also to close the chapter on the threat of an all-out nuclear war?
Well, I'm not optimistic. Whether you vote Democratic or Republican, you're going to get a candidate who is committed to the military-industrial complex, a candidate who is committed to Wall Street, a candidate who is committed to Israel. There's no essential difference in these points. Joe Biden has been a disaster for the United States, for Europe, for the Ukrainians. But Trump, I don't think that there would have been a war in Ukraine under Trump. But whether Trump is capable to wrap it up properly, I doubt it. And Trump is just as committed as Biden to the genocide in Gaza. So I don't expect any improvement in the Middle East policy, whether it be a Democrat or a Republican that sits in the White House. Personally, I will vote Jill Stein. And Jill Stein is the Green candidate who is a genuinely Green candidate, who is for peace, for negotiations, for the United Nations, for international law, for human rights, etc., etc. And it's not just lip service. And I would have voted for Robert F. Kennedy Jr. because I was a great admirer of his dad and an admirer of his uncle. On the other hand, he has said so many stupid things about Israel, and he has a level of Islamophobia that I cannot accept. So he doesn't get my vote. But I'm not optimistic that with Trump in the White House, we will not be facing an acute danger of a nuclear war. Now, in the European context, we've seen what happened in the parliamentary elections for the European Parliament, where the establishment parties, whether it's the Tories in England and Macron in France and Scholz in Germany, really got trounced. Now, I believe in Germany, for instance, that Sarah Wagenknecht is very much for peace negotiations in both Ukraine and Gaza, better today than tomorrow. The AfD, which of course is painted as, you know, the Nazis, etc., etc. It's not Nazis. I've read the party program. Actually, the AfD in Germany is more or less what the CDU was in Germany in the 1980s and 90s. It's just that the whole politics in Germany has evolved very negatively since the 1980s and 90s. And now anyone who believes in, I don't know, German history, German heritage, who takes at least some solace in German literature is accused of being a nationalist, accused of being a Nazi, or God knows. Again, I do not and have not given any lectures in Germany for 5 years, because Germany has become a totalitarian country where there is no freedom of opinion, no freedom of expression, no freedom of the press, and where there is such totalitarian legislation that if you say something that does not support the mainstream narrative, you risk that a sentence will be taken out of context from your speech, and you will suddenly be accused of anti-Semitism You will be accused of apology of war crimes and crimes against humanity. You will be accused of fake news. And it's not that I will not be able to defend myself. I'm a good lawyer. But again, I'm not registered as a lawyer in Germany. And I would have to get a German lawyer. And that would probably cost me 30,000, 40,000 euros. And beyond that, I would have to spend, you know, a good half year of my life trying to collect material to defend myself. Now, I have no inclination to do that. So if I get an invitation, and I have just gotten one today, if I get an invitation to go and give a lecture at University X, Y, or Z, I say very politely, thank you very much for the honor, but I'll pass this time. I mean, when you get back to the rule of law and you get back to the fundamental principles of freedom of expression and the right to dissent, the right to have a different opinion than you, if you ever go back to that, then I might accept in the future an invitation. So I'm very pleased that you have invited me to speak to your audience, and I have enjoyed it. One last word: I am an admirer of my then president, Jimmy Carter, who, by the way, is still alive. He's 99 years old on the 1st of October. Jimmy Carter turns 100. And I very much like this book. We Can Have Peace in the Holy Land. This man has put out blueprints for peace in Palestine. He has really done his level best to reach a viable modus vivendi between the Palestinian people and the Israelis. I am very dismayed that the American mainstream media is so completely controlled that a good word for the Palestinians renders you an anti-Semite. And there again, I would not speak in Germany. I feel very pleased to be a Swiss citizen and to reside in Geneva, Switzerland, where you can still express your opinions freely. And I hope that that will remain so for the rest of my life. But I am concerned about what I call the retrogression in human rights and the weaponization of human rights. For me, human rights are entitlements. We have the same, we're brothers. I mean, we're all children of the same God. Huh? I mean, whether you're Muslim or you're Catholic or you're Jew, we're all the same. We have the same aspirations, the same wishes. We want to be with our wives, with our children, with our families. I mean, we have, shall we say, 99% in common. And then just because of ideology, that 1%, we're going to be killing each other. I mean, it is total insanity. And then the weaponization of human rights, as I said, when instead of trying to help you solve your problems and address the grievances, what does the United States do and what does the Human Rights Council do? Condemn, condemn, condemn. You're bad, you're bad. That's what we call naming and shaming. Of course, naming and shaming would be useful if the person who is naming doesn't have a closet full of skeletons. But when we, the United States, are pointing fingers at Russia or at China or at Venezuela or at Cuba, etc., etc., the Cubans, the Syrians, would say, who the hell are you? Who do you think you are? I mean, you committed more crimes than we in all our history. So shut up. And but the atmosphere here in Geneva at the Human Rights Council is not an atmosphere of cooperation, of solidarity, of harmony. It is very much an atmosphere of invective, an atmosphere of insulting your enemy. I mean, because it's the other country is not a country that has a right to have its own opinion, has a right to have its own way. No, 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 no. I mean, you have to be confrontational. And I must say that has diminished the credibility of the institution. Going back to what I say, Juvenalis in his satire, Quis custodiet ipsos custodes, what do you do when those institutions like the Human Rights Council that are there to protect your rights actually betray you, when they are in the service of the hegemon, when they are only pushing a geopolitical agenda? And that is the situation that obtains today. If you come to Geneva, you will see it by yourself.
Professor de Zayas, thank you very much for being with us. I mean, it's been very, you have given us lots of food for thought, and all your analysis, I'm sure, are going to go down very well with the Turkish public and also with the general public, because we put it on in English with Turkish subtitles. Thank you very much again.
It'll be my pleasure to meet you someday in Ankara or in Istanbul. I have very good memories of my last visit to Istanbul years ago.
Oh, well, I would like to see you in Ankara or in Istanbul or in some other international.
In Cappadocia.
Cappadocia, yes. In Ankara is quite close.
You have enough to offer. You have beautiful things.
Excellent, excellent. As we say, inshallah, we'll do it.
Inshallah.
And hope to see you again. And thank you for joining us once again. And bye-bye for now.
Alhamdulillah.